What is being done to the Palestinians now is horrendous in their own territory by the occupying powers, which is Israel. They've taken away all the basic human rights of the Palestinians, as was done in South Africa against the blacks. And I make it very plain in this book that the apartheid is not based on racism, as it was in South Africa, but it's based on the desire of a minority of Israelis to acquire land that belongs to the Palestinians and to retain that land, and then to exclude the Palestinians from their own property and subjugate them so that they can't arouse and demonstrate their disapproval of being robbed of their own property. That's what's happening in the West Bank. And the people in this country, in America, never know about this. They never discuss this. There's no debate about it. There's no criticism of Israel in this country. And in Israel, there is an intense debate about the issues in this book. In this country, no.
The statements made in this video reflect historical perspectives that may be disputed depending on the viewer's point of view. No claim is being made that this is the sole version of events, and viewers are encouraged to explore multiple sources and form their own conclusions.
There's only one law in the Jewish law books that says, that expressly discriminates between Jewish and non-Jewish, which is the 1950 Law of Return. It says anyone who is Jewish can come to or come back to the land of Israel and become a full citizen. The way that discrimination works in Israel is usually laws work in combination or in reference to another law, where, for example, you need to be someone who would qualify for the law of return in order to get certain privileges. So it doesn't say you need to be Jewish, but it indirectly says that. Or the state will sort of devolve part of its sovereignty to an organization or institution that does discriminate, but it's not in the law book. So, for example, responsibility over most of the land in the part of Palestine that was taken in 1948, or Israel, is directly or indirectly under the control of the Jewish National Fund. 16% of the land is directly under the control of the Jewish National Fund. Then most of the rest, about 78%, is under the control of something called the Israeli Lands Administration, which the Jewish National Fund appoints around half of its board members. So this is the indirect part. So that's 93%. Approximately of the land of Israel, which is under the sort of the Jewish National Fund decides. And again, in its own constitution, the Jewish National Fund's purpose is exclusively Jewish settlement, Jewish colonization. Now, in these cities, I mean, this is one of the big ironies of the thousands of ironies in this land. Jewish immigrants coming to these cities saw a neighborhood which was fenced off. People needed military permission to come in and out, and only had one word for it, which is ghetto. And so if you go to Jaffa or Lid or Ramle, these neighborhoods are still referred to as the ghetto, even by the Palestinian residents, many of whom still believe until today that the word ghetto is the Hebrew word for Palestinian neighborhood. And this is specifically the case in Lid and Ramle. So between 48 and 66, the Israeli government confiscated thousands of dunums or acres of what remained in Palestinian hands. And the way that this would work is, for example, the laws would work in combination. Like I said, there's about 22 laws, military laws. These were the equivalent of a constitution for Palestinian citizens of Israel during this period. So one law would enable the military to come into an area and declare it a closed military area, which means no Palestinians can be here. And so the Palestinians would be kicked out. Another law would say that if a land is left uncultivated for 3 years, it becomes property of the state. So you'd be kicked out of your land because it's been transformed into a military area. 3 years later, you'd be summoned to a court, or you'd receive a piece of paper that says your land's been confiscated or is now property of the state because it's been uncultivated for over 3 years. And if you go to challenge it and say, well, your military is the one that kicked me out, the response will be, well, you can take that up with the military. We're just applying the law here. So this is how these thousands of acres were taken from Palestinians during this period. Now, to understand, I mean, a lot of people talk about the situation in Palestine as being very complicated and complex and hard to understand. in my view, it isn't that hard to understand. There is complexity if you want to look at the details of Israeli laws and how this works and how laws work in combination with one another. But overall, if you want to understand what's happening here, it can be summarized in one line. The main purpose of the Zionist movement was and continues to be maximum land under exclusive Jewish control, minimum Palestinians on that land. If you understand this, you understand what happened in 1948, you understand the purpose of the military regime between 48 and 66, you understand what happened in the 67 war and since in the West Bank and Gaza, and continues to happen every day today. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Negev, just because it's, some people have called, Salman Abu Sitta calls it the forgotten half of Palestine. And in many ways he's right, because people generally don't know what's happening in the south of Palestine. The Nakba, or Negev as it's known in Hebrew, is the south of Palestine. It's largely a desert area, and the Palestinians who inhabit it are what anthropologists call Bedouin, and they themselves call themselves Badu. And it's a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle where people travel often within a certain area, but a large area, and life depends on pasture, sort of raising sheep and goats, as well as agriculture when there's enough water or there's good rainfall, and in some cases trade, sort of being the merchants between one area and another. So the Bedouin of Palestine, or Palestinian Bedouin, in 1948, the vast majority of them were expelled. So out of the 90 to 110,000 Bedouin Palestinians before 1948, about 10,000 only remained. The rest were forced to leave. And when I say forced to leave, just because some people also say that, well, people left of their own volition, or in times of war people leave. The fact of the matter is that even if they weren't forced to leave at gunpoint, which many people were, but many people just left, like I said, news of massacres or because there was a war happening, what Israel did after its establishment was ensured that anybody who did leave wasn't able to come back. They were called infiltrators, anyone who tried to come back, and the orders of border patrols were to arrest or shoot on sight anyone who was trying to come back. And many people died actually because they were shot at as infiltrators. And some people did manage to come back in. Also, I should note that all of the land of the refugees and the displaced people was confiscated by the State of Israel, which passed a law called the Absentee Property Law in 1950. And all of this land, which is over 80% of what Israel considers its own state land now, and Jewish National Fund controlled land, is absentee property. For those people who are internally displaced, the Palestinians whose villages or towns were destroyed, but they managed to stay within the state and they're citizens of the state, their property is absentee property. It's been taken by the state. But since they're not really absentees, they're still there, Israeli law has essentially created a new status. They're present absentees. Sort of apparently a contradiction, but they're present physically in the state, but they're absentees as far as their property is concerned. Now, in the case of the Negev, or the Nakba, the vast majority, or all Bedouin Palestinians who remained, were concentrated in the area around Beersheba, which was called the area of the fence. Even though most of it didn't have a physical fence surrounding it, you needed military permission to be able to leave this area or to enter it. And in 1965, what Israel did was it passed a law called the Planning Law, which essentially outlines, it's a big, massive law, maybe one of the largest laws in the world, which essentially lists all of the towns, villages, cities of the Israeli state. And it doesn't list many of the Palestinian villages. 46 villages in the Nakba are not listed, and in the Galilee also several villages are not listed. These become known as the unrecognized villages. And these unrecognized villages, because they're not recognized, they don't appear on any state map, but they also receive no municipal services. So no electricity, no water, no roads, no sewage, no waste collection, largely no schools, and any other essential services that you can think of. Also, because they're not recognized as resident villages places where people live, the houses that they live in are subject to demolition. And so those houses there's been an ongoing process since 65 until today of destroying those houses. And the fact that people don't know about it is why it's the forgotten half of Palestine, essentially. In the late 60s, what Israel decided to do, and this was because these Bedouin Palestinians still were a form of like continuity between Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, was to further remove them from these unrecognized villages. And the plan was to create or to recognize some of the villages and force everyone into them. They're actually called concentration towns. So these concentration towns, there were 7 towns, they became towns, that were recognized and became concentration towns. And Israeli policy since then has been trying to cram Palestinians from the unrecognized villages into the concentration towns, which are the poorest towns, by far, the poorest towns in Israel. So there's been an acceleration of house demolition and policies that aim to displace Palestinian Bedouin from the unrecognized villages into the concentration towns. Some of these policies, many of these policies hit at the economic life of Bedouin Palestinians, which involves laws that severely restrict their ability to raise their flocks, their goats. There's a law specifically dealing with the black goat, which is, and black goats, like camels, are kind of an indigenous species to the desert. But this law says that they're a hazard to the environment. And so black goats being a hazard to the environment, any stray black goat becomes property of the state. And the state can kill it, can do whatever it pleases with it. In the late 70s, Ariel Sharon, who was specifically interested in the case of Palestinian Bedouin, and the Israeli policy officially calls these things Judaization, sort of kicking out Palestinians and making an area predominantly Jewish is what they call Judaization. So the Judaization of the Negev was one of the kind of pet projects of Ariel Sharon. In the late 70s, he becomes the Minister of Agriculture and forms a military unit that answers to the Ministry of Agriculture. They were called Green Patrols. And these Green Patrols would drive around and find any Palestinian who was sort of grazing his goats. And they would drive down with their jeeps and sort of honk the horns and shoot their guns in the air. And the goats would disperse. And so then it was a race between the shepherd and the Green Patrol as to who could go and collect the goats faster. In some cases, they would just shoot the goats. And actually, during the Nakba, and until today, the process of essentially killing the goats themselves, and the sheep, and all the other, and the camels, and everything else that are raised by Bedouin Palestinians, has been a mainstay of the ongoing forced displacement of Bedouin Palestinians. Whether through actually using poison. So, for example, between 2002 and 2004, the military would fly planes that would spray Roundup, poisonous herbicide, definitely poisonous to animals and humans. And on the package, I think it says you cannot aerially spray this because it's too dangerous. They would spray from the air, and many people got very, very sick. Some people died. There was high rates of miscarriages, but also many goats died. Thousands of goats died. Also, restricting access to water and to pastures, especially on drought years, is one way that the Israeli government has effectively also killed off many of these flocks, the shepherds. So it's very much an ongoing case of a living case of the ongoing Nakba. But of course, everywhere in Palestine, you see the ongoing Nakba. So until today, Palestinian citizens of Israel in the cities of Jaffa, Lid, Akka, and definitely in Jerusalem, are facing an accelerated program of Judaization. In Jaffa, those who remained in the Ajami neighborhood, the ghetto, today about 500 houses are subject to eviction and demolition. So that's thousands of people, 500 families. They're going to be kicked out of their homes. specifically to destroy the home. I mean, in all of these cases in the cities, it's called development, Jewish development or Zionist development. And development essentially is it's gentrification. The idea is to tear down these houses and build expensive condominiums and shopping malls, most often for Jewish people living abroad, to come here for the summer or for the winter as they see fit. So it's this dual process of gentrification and Judaization. So some people are going to make a lot of money selling these condos, and the Zionist ideologues are going to be very happy because Jaffa has many or far fewer Palestinians in it. In 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as the Golan Heights from Syria and Sinai from Egypt. Essentially, this formed a bit of a problem for the Israelis, in the sense that, given the underlying maxim of the Zionist movement, maximum land under exclusive Jewish control and minimum Palestinians on it, there were many more Palestinians now under Israeli control. Now what happened in 1967 was Israel forcibly expelled another 450,000 Palestinians. Half of them were refugees from 1948, being displaced for the second time. So they needed a plan on how to deal with this much larger number of Palestinians under their control. And the solution sort of came from a military officer and minister by the name of Yigal Allon. And this Allon plan basically calls for, first of all, completely annexing the area, this area called the Latrun area, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where there's 3 Palestinian villages, Amwas, Yalu, and Bet Nuba. And these villages, 10,000 residents of these villages are immediately expelled, and the villages are flattened. Today, on the site, there's a Jewish National Fund park funded by the Canadian arm of the Jewish National Fund. It's called Canada Park. And visitors can come and picnic on the ruins of the village. And what remains of the ruins of the village, there's little signs that talk about how this is an ancient bath or an ancient well, but nothing, of course. And this is the case throughout 48 Palestine or Israel, where any kind of historical plaque or official history will completely erase and not mention any Palestinian presence. If Palestinians are mentioned, they're mentioned as kind of barbarians. So you'll see in Jaffa, for example, plaques that talk about the history of Jaffa over thousands of years. But the only time that Arabs and Palestinians are mentioned is to say that in the 20s or 30s they attacked the Jewish community. There was a savage attack. So this is the case in Canada Park as well. The 2 central parts of the Allon plan are, one, to split the West Bank into 2 parts, a northern part and a southern part, with Jerusalem as the divider. The idea being that Jerusalem would become completely under Israeli control and then would be continued down to the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley using perhaps the most important Israeli settlement in the West Bank, which is called Ma'ali Adumim. And then the second crucial part of the Allon plan is to eliminate any Palestinian presence on the border with Jordan, specifically the Jordan Valley. So the area of the West Bank north of the Dead Sea, and where it's the lowest point in the world, sort of altitude-wise. And it's also one of the most fertile areas in Palestine. There's a lot of water, groundwater and surface water, wells and the river. And because it's warm all year round, you can grow 2 or 3 crops in a year. So there were a lot of people living there. Only about 10,000 people remained. This includes the city of Jericho, which is the oldest city in the world, oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It was established something like 9,000 BC. So the Jordan Valley was and Jerusalem are the initial sites of what we can call the ongoing Nakba in the West Bank. In Jerusalem, many residents, of course, are forced to leave, are expelled throughout the West Bank and to Jordan. And since then, Jerusalem has been the site of heavy Judaization. Today, the municipality, the Israeli-controlled Jerusalem municipality, basically, its official policy is that no more than 30% of the city's residents can be Palestinian. This is in its what they call local Local Outline Plan 2000 or something like this, which is essentially the master plan for the city. The municipality and other organizations sort of that are part of the Israeli state and the Zionist movement heavily fund Jewish settlement in the city, particularly in the Palestinian neighborhoods and the Old City. And licensing for Palestinian homes, even if you want to build an extra floor on top of your existing house, are virtually impossible to get. People's homes are destroyed pretty consistently under the pretext that they're not licensed. And more recently, they're using the excuse that, to the effect that, the destruction of your home will serve the purpose of the Jewish state. So will serve the purpose of Judaizing the city. So more explicit even on this front. Palestinian religious and cultural life in Jerusalem is heavily restricted. Over the past year, people trying to commemorate the Nakba, or this initiative to nominate Jerusalem as the Arab cultural capital for 2009. Most of these activities have faced police repression, arresting the organizers and shutting down the events. And that's just this year. Access to the religious holy sites, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Aqsa Mosque, the Noble Sanctuary, etc., is heavily restricted. First of all, Palestinians in the West Bank outside of Jerusalem are not allowed into Jerusalem without military permit. And for like the important prayers, they just don't give permits to anyone below the age of 45, sometimes 55. In the Jordan Valley, like I said, most of the residents were expelled, with only about 10,000 people remaining. Since then, Israel has reclassified the area largely as military zones, so closed military areas. Basically, the emergency laws, military laws that were implemented against Palestinians in the 48 areas were then implemented against Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So it's the same, it's Military Order 125 that declares an area a closed military zone in 48 areas in Israel and also here. So most of these areas in the Jordan Valley were declared closed military areas, but there's other sort of more seemingly benign ways of displacing people. Some areas are declared natural reserves, for animals or for trees, and the Palestinian residents have to leave these areas. So Palestinian presence in the Jordan Valley has been under ongoing forced displacement over the past 40 years, but today there's a push to essentially eliminate Palestinian presence outside of 5 villages in the Jordan Valley and the city of Jericho, or their towns actually, zoned as Area B under the Oslo agreements. So through the 70s and 80s, basically, and particularly beginning in the late 70s, there's a big push to we can call this attitude, why carve up the West Bank into 2 reservations when we can cut it up into more? And this is Ariel Sharon's main project, especially beginning in the late 70s. The idea being, one, we can give a green light to the more religiously motivated Zionists who see the West Bank, which they call Judea and Samaria, as the site of the old kingdom of David and Solomon, and will want to go and settle there. And so this green light is given. The idea being that civilians can come in and set up homes, or even like tents or caravans anywhere, and then the army would be obligated to go and protect them. And so through the 70s, 80s, and then definitely in the 90s, there's a big explosion of these kinds of activities. And the idea being that, and always, invariably, settlements are on hilltops. So they always take the most strategic part of the land, and then this divides Palestinian communities from one another. And then as these settlements expand, Palestinian farmland, and in some cases the villages themselves, become the land that the settlement wants, and the people are displaced as a result. Now, so this is called the Sharon Plan, actually, in the late 70s, and is the kind of the blueprint for what became the Oslo Accords. The main obstacle for Sharon, and for any Israeli regime, to implement this vision of Palestinians sort of encircled within their communities, where the rest of the land is taken control of by the Israeli government, again under the idea maximum land under exclusive Jewish control, minimum Palestinians on it. So the idea would be that if we can't kick all the Palestinians out, those who remain can be encircled. This is what's happening in the Negev, this is what's happening in the Galilee and in the Triangle, and definitely in the West Bank. Gaza has been encircled since the mid-90s, completely blocked, and for the past 2 years this encirclement has meant a siege. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out. Unless, they can dig a tunnel, which is what they've done with the border with Egypt. But other than that, it's a pretty tight siege, which has cost thousands of lives, but also made life hell, in addition to the constant military bombardment and military assaults that take place. All under the pretext of there's some homemade rockets that are fired into Sderot, into nearby Israeli areas. I mean, the refugees of Gaza, in particular, for the most part, are no more than 20 kilometers away from their original lands. So Gaza is 1.5 million people. 1.1 million people in Gaza are refugees. So over 2/3 of people in Gaza are refugees. The issue of Gaza, in addition to being an issue of military occupation and humanitarian crisis, is primarily a refugee issue. Gaza would not be a problem if the refugees were allowed to go back to their homes. In the case of the West Bank, the main, and this also applies to Gaza, the main issue facing the Israeli regime was, if we're going to encircle and segregate Palestinians into these small pockets that Israel controls the surroundings, there needs to be a Palestinian partner who controls the daily lives of Palestinians and polices inside these areas so that they don't form any threat to the Israeli state or Israeli security outside. So in the late 70s, the Israeli government initiates a plan to form something called village leagues, which is this kind of Palestinian partner that's essentially a proxy for the Israeli government. This is not a new thing. In North America, for example, indigenous native communities are governed by their tribal councils. In Canada, they're called band councils. And these are very tightly controlled, at least their budgets are, from Washington or from Ottawa. In Palestine, the village leagues also, the main reason for their failure was that the Palestine Liberation Organization waged a campaign against it, and one of the central mottos of the Palestine Liberation Organization is that the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And so people didn't fall for the village leagues. This was the lesson for Israel, that either we have to eliminate the PLO in order to sort of implement this idea of the encircled Palestinian communities governed by loyal, obedient Palestinians, or we need to get the PLO itself to play this role for us. And the result was the combination. Through the series of defeats in the 80s, the leadership, or what remained of the leadership of the PLO, accepted the Oslo agreements. And the Oslo agreements are, at their core, the blueprint for the implementation of this kind of system, this Bantustan apartheid system in the West Bank.